Good afternoon. Welcome to part one of our three-part webinar series, What EPA Brownfields Grantees Should Know, hosted by NJIT Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities. Today's webinar will focus on the topic of procurement. We're excited to have you all here, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to spend it with us. Whether you're a new grantee or just need a refresher on requirements, all are welcome. My name is Fatma Meitos, and I'm the events coordinator here at NJIT's Center for Community Systems. It is my pleasure to introduce a woman with over 20 years of experience managing public and private sector construction projects, Jennifer Taylor. Ms. Taylor joins us from BRS Inc. as part of the NJIT TAB service provider team and is well versed in procurement and contracting for the remediation and construction efforts needed to support brownfield redevelopment. She has also managed multi-million-dollar development projects, as well as served as a community and government liaison for the implementation of federally funded assessment and cleanup work. As a licensed professional engineer and a certified lead professional, she joins us today as our procurement guru. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me today. Appreciate everybody joining and taking a little time out of their afternoon to talk about the wonderful world of procurement and how it relates to our EPA grants. So first, I'm just going to take you through a little bit of the agenda. If you go to the next slide. So we're going to be discussing the applicability for the EPA grants, how to prepare a solicitation, and some pitfalls you might want to keep in mind, the evaluation criteria, compliance with BABA, and then we'll have the Q&A session at the end. So jumping into the applicability, so really all EPA grants have some element of procurement to keep in mind, whether you've got an assessment, cleanup, revolving loan fund, multipurpose, everything really does have elements of procurement that you want to make sure you are planning for and handling appropriately. So as you start to think about the implementation of your EPA grant, you're going to want to consider the types of contracts that you're going to need to set up. And depending on the scope of your work, you may end up with multiple contracts over the course of the grant period. So generally, the contracts fall into a few categories. Professional services, that might be your engineering services, your grant management services, things along those lines. Equipment or supplies, which is sort of less common, but that's direct purchase of equipment or supplies. And then construction, which is sort of the larger contracts to put in place and is generally more on the cleanup end. Next slide. So here's my little legal disclaimer. So this presentation is no substitute for legal advice. Absolutely recommend that you do speak with your legal counsel or other internal folks in your organization as you are working through this procurement process. And also the things we're going to be talking about today really focus on the federal procurement requirements. So also important to keep in mind are your state and local requirements as well. Next slide. So going into the methods for securing the contracts. So as I said, there's a different variety of the kinds of contracts you're going to have between the construction, the professional services, things along those lines. Whether or not you need to go out for open public bid, whether or not you can request quotes, or whether or not you can go through a RFP process is going to be a determining factor in how you're going to approach your bid process and all of your procurement steps. And as I said before, there may be multiple contracts that need to be set up as well. So taking a step back at the beginning and really understanding how you want to get to your end goals is extremely important. And throughout this whole process, I always recommend engaging your EPA procurement officer because they deal with lots of different communities and can really lend some good advice as to how best to approach the solicitation process. So one of the first things you're going to want to think about is the size of the solicitation. So the scope of work that you're trying to complete, getting a solid cost estimate for that to understand if you're going to be in a micro procurement, small procurement, or if you're going to have to go out through the competitive bidding process for either bids or proposals. So the federal thresholds are here, but you also need to keep in mind your state and local thresholds as well. And that may dictate whether or not you need to go through the bid process or if you can go through just going through quotes. So as we mentioned, there's the different kinds of categories: quotes, open public bid. You may also want to consider going through a contractor pool, so requesting qualifications so that you have certified vendors that you can access through the course of the grant period. Another option may be able to go through a sole source. That's a non-competitive bid process. Definitely takes a lot more documentation in order to be able to, justify the use of a sole source contract, but sometimes it does make sense depending on the scope of work that you're doing. Your professional services, equipment and supplies procurement can really be done through any of these types of procurement measures. Typically, construction services are going to be through the open public bid process, so that's just something to keep in mind. And if you are not going to be awarding to the lowest bidder, you want to make sure that you are providing proper documentation and rationale for the selection of the vendor. And a lot of the documentation, you want to make sure that you keep it organized, because you may have to provide it to EPA's grant management office as well. So kind of taking a step back through setting up your procurement process, you want to look at the schedule. You want to think of this as an opportunity to kind of map out the way your project is going to go. So looking at the sequence of work, which contracts do you need to establish early on versus which ones should be waiting until later? What timelines you're going to need for advertisement. EPA recommends that you have at least a 30-day advertisement window for your RFPs and for your RFQs. And really, you want to work backwards from when you want to be starting. So, are there holidays in between there that you need to account for? Will you have enough time in order to evaluate your proposals and give everybody, a decent review before you make your determination for your vendor? Will you have to go before board approval? So missing a board approval date could push back the overall project timeline by several months sometimes. So important things to keep in mind. And then also how you're going to approach your good faith efforts for solicitation of proposals to your DBEs. So now you've kind of taken a big step back, understand the way you want to move forward, and now we're going to get into more of the details about preparing the solicitation. So first and foremost, read your cooperative agreement. They can be long, they can be complicated, but they are super important. And absolutely do not assume that it was like the last one. So if you do have, multiple EPA grants under your belt, sometimes you can kind of get caught up in thinking, oh, I've done this before, I know what I need to do. I always recommend reading it and understanding it, because there are often nuances that change from grant to grant. So looking at some of the things that you might find in your cooperative agreement requirements, Davis-Bacon Act and prevailing wage rates may both be needed for inclusion in your procurement documents. The wage rates themselves do need to be provided by the entity that is posting the solicitation. You may also have a requirement for the Build America, Buy America, so BABA, which we're going to talk about in a little bit more detail as we move forward. Debarment certifications, so you want to ensure that the vendors that are responding to the solicitation don't have any debarment concerns. And so we strongly recommend that the sam.gov is checked for each vendor that responds. And so one of the recommendations that EPA also makes is including an option in your RFP or your RFQ to potentially allow use for contractors to conduct work throughout that grant or in future grants. So that is definitely something to consider and allow some flexibility. Restrictions, limitations, and advantages. All right, so this is kind of some helpful hints to think about as you are starting your procurement process. You do not want to seek or accept any assistance from a contractor in preparing your RFP or RFQ if that vendor plans on submitting a response to that solicitation. The assistance can include situations where the contractor provides sample RFPs. So really in these sorts of instances, if you don't have sort of a library of documentation that you can refer to, it's very helpful to go online, look for other examples, or again, reach out to your EPA project officer, because they are able to provide you with examples, or through the technical assistant program through TAB. Similarly, you do not want to include the work plan in your RFP or RFQ if you received assistance from a contractor in developing that, and that contractor is interested in responding to the solicitation. You don't want to mention other contractors in your RFP or your RFQ. And you don't want to state that you are only seeking firms with experience with EPA Brownfield grants, because that does limit the competition. And you do not want to specify a specific brand name. If you are going to put in a brand name, you would also want to include a or equal approved option. And so really all of this is aimed at creating a fair and diverse procurement process. Setting up for success. So obviously procurement is extremely important, but you really want to look holistically at all of the work that you are going to be doing. So as part of that, you want to think about your community engagement. Is there helpful to kind of get the word out before your solicitation is advertised? Stakeholder engagement, this can be a whole variety of different entities within the community, board members. So that way, when your procurement is complete and you're looking to do your award and get your resolution before the board, they're already engaged in understanding what the project is and why it's of value to the community. Multiple funding sources. So oftentimes it's not just the EPA funds that are going into the project. There would possibly be other funding coming in that may dictate language that needs to be included in your procurement. So definitely important to keep in mind and ensure that you do a solid review before you advertise so that you don't have conflicting information in there. Contract administration. So really the whole procurement process is teeing you up for running the contract. So you want to consider what language you might want to include in the solicitation that covers how you're going to be handling contract administration. And similarly, your format for payment requests. So if there are any specific requirements, this can also link back to having multiple funding sources and the way that you need the documentation presented when the vendors are coming in for payment. So all of that can really be rolled into the procurement language. Getting into the evaluation criteria. So another piece of information you want to make sure that you are including in your RFP or your RFQ is what the evaluation criteria is going to be. So that way vendors responding really understand how it's going to be evaluated and what the award is going to be based on. So for your RFP or RFQ, you want to include your weighted factors against which the responses are going to be evaluated. That can be percentages or point system. Pricing, which is always a factor. You want to make sure that that's represented in there. And generally, the EPA recommends at least a 25% weighted average for that. Other factors that you want to include could be experience, capacity, and your references as well. And depending on what the percentage is going to be for each procurement may depend on the scope of work that you are advertising for. All right, so getting into Build America, Buy America. If you haven't had experience with this before, this is just going to kind of be a high-level overview. There is another TAB webinar that is going to get into more detail about this. But for our discussion in relation to procurement, really what this means is that with the EPA grants, we were required to have all iron, steel, manufactured products, and construction materials used in the project to be produced in the United States. This really comes into play more often when you're doing cleanup work, but it's absolutely important to consider with every solicitation that you do. When necessary, you want to make sure that you're including that language in the solicitation and in the contract. Thinking about the type of work early on really helps because you may be able to apply for waivers. There's a variety of different waivers that can be granted for this, but two of the common ones we have listed here, which is the small project waiver and the de minimis waiver. So the responsibilities of the grantee, what do you need to keep in mind for BABA as you're moving forward? So at the procurement step, you want to make sure that you're including the regulations in the bid documents and also including the requirements for the contractors. Be aware of the materials that you're going to be using in the project and request the waivers in advance whenever possible. And include in the bid documents really what the contractors are going to be responsible for providing. So with every material that is going to be remaining in place on the project on the site, and this is a fixed product. So basically, if you are, installing chain link fence, this might apply. If you are putting chairs for whatever reason into the project, those wouldn't because they're not fixed. So within the construction management piece, the contractors are going to be responsible for providing documentation that the materials are made in the US. And that documentation does need to be retained for audits. So you can include all of those stipulations within the procurement documents to ensure that it's not a conflict once you're under contract. So the kind of big picture for how this helps the community is that really doing a well-prepared and a thought-out procurement process can save time and money. Making the best use of the grant funds for the grantee and really the end users of the project. We can avoid going back out for rebid or having to deal with change orders down the road. And really helps the project to come to fruition in a clean timeline within your grant period. So there's two references that we've included. The first one is the best practices guide for procuring services, supplies, equipment under the EPA assistance agreements. So this is a larger document. It's about 30 pages. But once you are in the procurement process, it really is a wonderful resource to kind of help guide you and deal with some of the nuances that you might be facing. And then the Brownfields grants guidance on competitively procuring a contractor. This one's only a 2-pager. It's a really great reference. A lot of the information that's in there is information we went through on the slides today. And it can be a nice refresher before you start setting up your procurement. Now going into the Q&A session, I will hand it back over to Fatima. Thanks very much.
Great. Thank you so much, Jennifer. And I'm seeing there's some difficulty with that second link. We'll go ahead and send a better link for that. Not a problem. Now let's get into some questions. I'm going to give folks a few moments to type in their questions in the Q&A window before we begin. Should anyone present today have any additional questions or comments after this webinar ends, feel free to utilize our post-webinar survey or connect with us on the NJIT TAB LinkedIn page. You may also visit our website at www.njit.edu/tab or other social media platforms to access more information, resources, and news. We would love to connect with you after today to see how we could assist you in your EPA Brownfield grantee journey. In fact, NJIT TAB can provide a multitude of services for EPA regions 2 and 4. We serve as a free independent resource to state, territory, regional, county, tribal, and local government entities and nonprofits attempting to learn about, identify, assess, clean up, and redevelop brownfields. At NJIT TAB, we help through our Brownfields Academy, Brownfield Community Engagement and Educational Forums, and one-on-one technical assistance. Along with virtual webinars such as today, NJIT TAB could assist you with other virtual or in-person Brownfield Community Engagement and Educational Forums. From beginner-friendly Brownfield basics to more hands-on technical events such as, but not limited to, panel sessions, community workshops, and Breaking Brownfields, where we invite private sector representatives and experts to answer your project-specific questions. NJIT TAB can meet you wherever you are in the Brownfields process. We also provide one-on-one technical assistance where we offer tailored guidance for many Brownfield-related tasks and can answer any questions that you may have about your Brownfield project. If you'd like more information, we also host our Brownfield Academies on our website, again, at www.njit.edu/tab. Yes, I'll keep repeating it. Here you could find a wealth of information such as how-to videos, infographics, success stories, previously recorded webinars, news, upcoming events, and more. Speaking of upcoming events, I'd like to speak about some upcoming events that you may be interested in. First off, we have some virtual events coming up. Join us August 21st as we partner with Hudson Valley Pattern for Progress for a Brownfields Revitalization Lunch and Learn. During this virtual webinar, attendees will learn about successful efforts in the Northeast that have utilized brownfield grants and tax credits to revitalize downtowns. You can also join us on August 27th for part 2 of our 3-part series, What EPA Brownfield Grantees Should Know. Part 2 will focus on the Davis-Bacon Act and Build America, Buy America, which Jennifer kind of touched on today. When it comes to federally funded construction contracts, you don't know what you don't know. Join us and our expert, Alicia Flamia, where she will provide EPA Brownfield grants and overview of these Act's requirements as they pertain to EPA grant implementation. The webinar will include a discussion on the responsibilities of both the grantee and contractors from procurement through construction management and contract administration. On September 5th, join us for the final part of our 3-part virtual series, again, What EPA Brownfield Grantees Should Know. Join us and our expert, Laura Burnham, as she guides attendees through grant management, new to the world EPA Brownfield grants, or maybe you just need a refresher. The grant management webinar is designed to assist EPA Brownfield grantees successfully manage the grant from the time of award through grant closeout. It will cover EPA grant regulations for maintaining a grant file and reporting to the EPA. The webinar will also provide guidance on requesting payments from EPA and how to request changes after award. If meeting face-to-face is more of your cup of tea, we also have some in-person events coming up. On August 21st through the 23rd, NJIT TAB's Environmental Sustainability Planner, Carrie Martin, will be speaking at this year's Georgia Environmental Conference. Ms. Martin and co-panelists will be presenting the topic, Climate Smart for Brownfields Redevelopment, What You Need to Know. In this panel, Carrie will share lessons learned and ways to address resiliency needs while working with brownfield sites. On September 3rd through the 6th, Carrie Martin will also be at this year's Florida Planning Conference to continue the conversation on climate resiliency and brownfield redevelopment for the session, Resilient Reuse, Green Infrastructure and Brownfields. This panel session will include an introduction to brownfields, an overview of the negative public health impacts of brownfields, and how extreme events like flooding and extreme heat exacerbate the negative health impacts of brownfields, especially in low-income and communities of color. Attendees will hear how green infrastructure can improve air quality, water quality, and reduce flood and extreme heat impacts. They will also learn what to consider when implementing green infrastructure on brownfield sites. While in Florida, Carrie, man, you're heading up a tour, Carrie, across regions 2 and 4. We'll also be presenting a workshop on grant strategies for abandoned or underused contaminated properties. Join her September 5th to learn more about brownfields and how to develop competitive EPA Brownfield Program grant applications. I know, our audience here today is made up of a lot of grantee awardees. But when it comes to brownfields, no one grant can do it all. The most successful projects take advantage of a multitude of funding sources to create a funding stack for their project. Just wanted to reiterate those words that Jennifer said early. Perhaps you'll pick up some tips and tricks for your next grant writing endeavor. If you can't make it to Tampa, keep listening. We have a few grant writing workshops coming up in other parts of regions 2 and 4. On September 18th, NJIT TAB's Director of Environmental Services, Kaylin Bruno, will be in Quincy, Florida for Brownfields from Vacant to Vibrant. This interactive session will explore the opportunities that properties, referred to as a brownfield, can contribute to economic development in Gadsden County. Attendees will learn the basics of identifying and cleaning up these sites, how to access resources, perspectives on environmental justice, and planning for a resilient future. On September 19th, Kaylin will also be at this year's Alabama Brownfields Conference. Here she'll speak about the narrative side to grant writing during her panel, Write Your Story, Crafting Your EPA Brownfield Grant Narrative. And finally, on September 24th through the 25th, NJIT TAB will be presenting 2 sessions at Brownfield Coalition of the Northeast's Northeast Sustainable Communities Workshop. The first session, Tips and Strategies for EPA Grant Writing, Setting You Up for Success, will teach attendees the grant writing process and will provide practical tools and knowledge to set you up for success in securing EPA Brownfields funding. Again, for those who are already awardees, you might pick up some tips and tricks for your next one. The second session, Mining Community Assets for Funding Success, Telling Your Data Story for Grant Writing, will teach attendees how to gather existing data on your community's demographics, health, welfare, and geography to put your brownfield challenges in context. Discover how to transform these statistics and attributes into an impactful story, highlighting your community's unique assets and challenges. For those that can't make it to our events, or would like to access this webinar after today, we post recordings along with presentations and related resources and links on our website, again, at www.njit.edu/tab/webinars. Today, we've highlighted 3 for you that might complement your brownfield journey. Feel free to view those recordings after today's webinar or explore the NJIT TAB site to find a vast library of resources, links, and other informative videos. All right, with that information out of the way, let's see what questions and comments we have. All right, so the first one we have, I think I'm going to need a little bit more clarity on this question. I'm having a little bit trouble understanding. It says, I'm assuming you're asking for the advice on the practical difference between EPA state brownfields. Are you talking about brownfield grants? I just want some clarity. Mr. Kindman, if I pronounced that correctly, if you could put in the chat a little bit more about your question. We'll pause on that question for the moment to give Mr. Kindman a moment to answer it, and we'll go on to the next one. We'll go back to that one. All right, the second one comes from Gretchen Trask. Can you always use RFQ for professional services? When are you required to conduct an RFP with cost estimate?
So establishing a contractor pool, so going through the RFQ process is absolutely a appropriate way to secure professional services. And if you have an established pool that has followed the correct procurement processes, that's great. You just want to make sure that when you are putting out your solicitation to that pool, that you are including all of the required things from your cooperative agreement and all of the things that are unique to the EPA grant. So you don't want to just sort of cut and paste a solicitation that you had used previously. You definitely want to make sure you review it and include the correct things for this funding source. And so the other part of the question was, when are you required to conduct a RFP? So again, just check your local threshold requirements. That would be the only other piece, the federal, state, and your local thresholds, just to make sure that there isn't anything limiting you or requiring you to go out through a public bid process as opposed to utilizing a pool.
Great, thanks. I believe Mr. Cardman has responded. So his question is, why should I use EPA Brownfield for remediation as opposed to state Brownfield if both are available?
Well, I guess really a lot of projects I've been on kind of use a combination of the two. Because sometimes, costs of a project really aren't fully covered by just one funding source. And oftentimes there's also a match requirement for one or both funding sources. So the EPA funding coupled with state funding really does sometimes be the key to really completing the project. Another thing to keep in mind between the two funding sources would be eligibility. So there's certain pieces of work that may be eligible under one grant and not under another. So that's definitely something to look at when you are trying to figure out how to fund a project.
Perfect, thank you. And then I'm going to circle back to our previous question. Gretchen asked a follow-up question. Is there a scenario where you wouldn't be allowed to use an RFQ in your experience?
I think it's really just the things that would trigger requiring an open public bid process. So, I mean, construction comes to mind as one of them, certainly due to the cost and the nature of that work, that there would be a requirement to do a public advertisement and a open public bid process.
Gotcha. Thank you. All right. Our next question comes from Amy Williamson. And again, if I'm butchering any names, my apology, not my intent. um, our organization does an RFQ for professional engineering services generally every 3 years. From that RFQ, we enter into contract with several firms that we reach out to as needs arise. Is that a sufficient procurement process for the EPA, or would the EPA prefer we do an RFQ/RFP for each project? For context, we have an assessment grant.
So as you know, we mentioned the RFQs are definitely an appropriate process, but I think making sure that that solicitation met the requirements of the EPA's procurement requirements is the key. So that can certainly be a discussion with your EPA project officer, and if they have any concerns about the way that that procurement was conducted, you can discuss it in advance before putting out solicitations to that pool.
Great. I think this might be related. It was under the subtext of the question we just asked. From Amy Edemian. We've been using an LEP on our project using an RFQ process compliant with CTD-ECD guidance for phases 1 through 3, work funded by CTD-ECD grants. Can we sole source engineering, remedial design, and construction management oversight to this firm under the EPA cleanup grant, or is an RFQ required? There will be additional soil remediation and HBM funded by the EPA grant that will be procured separately based on the engineer's design and under their oversight.
So as with my disclaimer, so I am definitely not legal services, and I always recommend talking to your local procurement folks to make sure that you are doing everything by the book. Again, you want to check your threshold requirements, and to make sure that the solicitations that you have gone out previously meet all the EPA procurement requirements. Absolutely, a discussion with your procurement officer would be wise in that instance. But I think a lot of that would really come down to thresholds for the cost of the various work too.
Great, thank you. And then I
Oh,
think
and just one
oh,
other
go ahead.
like caveat on the sole source thing.
Yeah,
So sole source can be a wonderful option, but it definitely requires a lot of documentation. So you want to make sure that you have a solid case for why that entity is the only one that can appropriately provide the service. And often recommend seeking legal support in that too, just in case it's something that becomes a problem or a question later, or you have another bidder that puts in a question against it.
thank you. Perfect. All right, and I think this might be our last question. And again, if you want to add more, but when you say one can, this is from Sarah Ellis, my apologies. When you say one can do an RFQ for a contractor pool, does that mean you can choose from multiple bidders? Not necessarily the highest scoring?
So if your contractor pool is set up for professional services, then within that, you're going to be putting out specific solicitations to that pool of contractors. And so as part of that, you want to emphasize your evaluation criteria, similar to what we went through in the slides earlier. So within that solicitation to the pool, you would spell out what percentage or scoring you would have against other evaluation criteria. So not necessarily just price. As you said, EPA kind of guides you to do 25% of your minimum as price weighted. But other things like references, say the experience and history on similar projects, things along those lines can really have a larger influence rather than just price when it comes to the scoring process. And in those instances, you may not be ending up with the lowest bidder. And again, in those instances, it's always super important to document as to how you scored and why you scored the vendors.
Great, thank you. And then I see actually Miss Ellis actually raised her hand. I'm gonna see if we could, since we have we have some time before the hour is up, I'm gonna actually unmute her. And so that way she could ask any follow-up questions directly, if that's okay with you.
Yep.
Yeah,
Right.
I guess I was just, oh, sorry, can you guys hear me?
If you could speak a little bit louder, I'm having a little bit difficulty.
Sorry, I'll do my best. I guess I'm just confused about the concept of the contractor pool. If you could explain, because typically, as I understand procurement, we put it out through, we're putting it out to bid to anyone. I guess, could you explain the concept of, yeah, sorry.
Yeah.
Could
No,
you explain the concept of
absolutely.
contractor pool? Thank you so much.
Yeah, and if you're used to doing, quotes or proposals or the open public bid process, it is a little bit different. So really, when you're trying to set up a contractor pool, it is really looking for qualifications. So there's no guarantee of work, there's no contracts in place, there's no services that are specifically being requested with that advertisement. You're looking strictly for qualifications of vendors for a specific service. So say QEP, so you're qualified environmental professional. You put out sort of the general criteria for qualifications that you would be looking for, not linked to a specific project, site, or funding. And then when you do have a need, say for your EPA grant and a specific project property that you have eligibility approval through EPA for, you then create a solicitation for that specific scope of work, and then that gets advertised to that group of vendors that are pre-qualified. Does that kind of help?
Right. And then actually I see we got a question in the chat from Karen Keene. She said, can you talk more about sorry, I'm having trouble with this question. Can you talk more about how a sole contractor you mentioned? Any scenarios where that makes sense? And if Karen, Mhm.
Yeah, I can try to answer. And again, like kind of going back to what I said before, always seeking legal advice and talking with your procurement folks about it in advance, and also the EPA project officer too, just to make sure that you're not going to get tripped up with any issues. So sole contracts are fewer and farther between, but there are instances when it could make sense, when really there's just one vendor that is most appropriate in order to be able to conduct that work or do that service. They're the only ones that either provide it, or they have a particular reason that really can be documented and justified as to why it wouldn't make sense to go out through the procurement process for others. So documentation is really the key to that. And having discussions in advance, because you don't want to offer a contract to somebody and then realize that it could have made the use of the grant funds ineligible.
I'm going to ask you to unmute Karen just to make sure she was able to answer your question. Oh, that goes. There we go.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, great. I think that's all the questions we have for now. Again, in the chat, we put it up, and we also have it up here. Feel free to reach out to NJIT TAB with any further questions after today's webinar. We thank you for spending some time with us today. And we thank you, Jennifer, for speaking on procurement today. I hope you all have a great day. We hope to see you for parts 2 and 3 of our What Brownfield Grantees Should Know web series. Until then, we hope you take the lessons learned today to procure the keys to successful brownfield redevelopment. I'm sorry, I couldn't resist the pun.